It's been a bad year in that part of the Middle East we refer to, without irony, as the cradle of civilization. In Iraq and Syria, where many of the early pages of human history were written, not only has the conflict taken a terrible toll on the population, the rise of Daesh, the so-called Islamic State, has brought with it iconoclasm on a scale unprecedented in modern times, and certainly the largest mass destruction of cultural heritage since the Second World War.
Some of Iraq's most priceless artifacts dating back to the dawn of civilization were smashed or stolen from the country's National Museum.
And there's growing international condemnation of Islamic State for what's feared to be the destruction of the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrud, bulldozing numerous shrines and statues dating back 3,000 years.
This video online showed them apparently smashing statues in Mosul's museum.
Islamic State militants are reported to have blown up the Roman Temple of Bel in Syria. The Islamic State.
What explanations can we offer for this kind of destruction? Are there aspects of our own history, or the history of the three great monotheistic religions, which can help us understand why, for example, in August last year, the world was robbed of the fluted Corinthian columns and magnificent carved ceilings of the Temple of Bel? This was a building whose fusion of styles was a testament to the cosmopolitan history of Palmyra, the ancient desert city which grew rich from its position on the caravan route between east and west.
I cried. I cannot forget all my life the Temple of Bel. Never.
This is Dr. Ma'amoun Abul Karim, Director of Antiquities for Syria.
It was for me one of the more shock news, how we accept to lose this building. It is a beautiful icon in our architecture. It's connection between Occident and Orient. It's the saddest news coming for me until now. We should move very quickly before to be too late after 6 months, 5 months. I'm sure we will have the more bad image from Palmyra.
Last year will have to go down as the worst year we can remember. I've been involved in archaeology for nearly 40 years. The losses last year, Palmyra, the Temple of Bel, the Temple of Baal-Shamin, the Tower Tombs as well. And although as a percentage of the whole site, it's not a great area, they were significant monuments. We know that the Northwest Palace in Nineveh was blown up. We lost the mosque at Nabi Yunus in Iraq. There's a site in Syria which has yet really to hit the headlines, a site called Dura Europos on the Euphrates. And when you see the air photographs from the 1930s and now look at the satellite images, this is a completely pockmarked landscape, and most of the archaeology has been destroyed.
Dr. Robert Bewley of the University of Oxford heads a project that maps and records the damage to precious ancient sites. It's one of a host of organisations, mostly in the West, doing what they can from a distance to mitigate the effects of Daesh jackhammers and the mortar attacks. And it is the local population, along with scholars and museum curators, who are risking their lives scrambling to remove the treasure from vulnerable sites in Iraq and Syria. Jeremy Bowen, the BBC's Middle East editor, told us the story he heard from Khalil Hariri, director of the museum in Palmyra, who together with his brothers-in-law Tariq and Mohammed attempted to clear the site before the arrival of Islamic State militants.
They were working against time. They could hear the sound of fighting getting closer. Then on the morning that Islamic State came into Palmyra, they thought they'd be okay because they knew that the Syrian army had tried to mount a counterattack.
By then, we had salvaged 3 truckloads of antiquities. As the last of the 3 was about to depart, we were fired at by rifles.
As they were loading what turned out to be the final cases onto a lorry, the fighting entered Museum Square, and bullets were pinging around them and making the awful sound that bullets make, which is, when they go near your head, it's like a kind of mad insect noise. As the jihadist fighters came in to Museum Square, they threw the last crate in and accelerated out, and as they left, they got some fire directed at the lorry, and Khalil Hariri, He said that he was wounded by it, but they pressed on, and really they just drove like hell.
They had to leave behind the huge and heavy statues and artifacts. For their trouble, of course, what they could expect from ISIS was revenge.
They've had revenge already. Their father was the former director of antiquities in Palmyra and head of the museum.
Khalid al-Assad spoke Aramaic, the ancient language of Palmyra. Few archaeologists knew more about his history. Family and friends urged him to leave the World Heritage Site, but he refused, nor was he about to reveal the safe places to which his sons were transporting the treasures of the ancient city. And so, in one of its squares, he was publicly beheaded.
Old man, all his life, he served Palmyra. Why we accept as modern civilization to see some act like this? Our work is very difficult. We lost until now 15 persons beheaded by sniper, explosion, etc. The life of the archaeologists in Syria really is very difficult, but we should to resist, to stay until last minute.
So what, if any, is the logic behind this violent spate of iconoclasm? Before lighting the fuse wire or unleashing the crowbar on the Temple of Bel or the tombs of Palmyra, what justification do the jihadists offer for their fury? John Curtis currently heads the Iran Heritage Foundation. For many years he was keeper of the Middle Eastern department at the British Museum.
The Temple of Baal is actually dedicated to a heathen god, Baal, and that's presumably why they believe that it can be destroyed. If we think about funerary towers, our shrines, they're monuments to dead people. One of the prohibitions in extreme interpretations of Islam is against memorials dedicated to the dead. So, for example, kings of Saudi Arabia are buried in the middle of the desert without any kind of markers, and this is why ISIS have been destroying cemeteries, for example, in the Mosul region. They've been ripping up gravestones and so on.
Dr. Usama Hasan is an imam and a senior researcher in Islamic Studies at the Quilliam Foundation. I asked him how he felt as a devout Muslim at the destruction at Nimrud and Palmyra.
I was deeply saddened as somebody who loves history, who's aware of the immense interest which Muslim scholars have paid to the study of history for 14 centuries, a study which is actually encouraged by the Quran, which repeatedly says, go and travel in the land and see the landmarks of the people who lived before you, what they got up to, the amazing things they achieved, and whether or not they were grateful to God.
Osama, what if you could say something about the second commandment, specifically how its prescriptions have been received in the Quran or perpetuated in the Quran and the importance of that?
About the second commandment, what's very interesting is that the 10 commandments are largely reproduced in the Quran in a couple of passages, but they actually miss out the second commandment. They don't mention the graven images. What we do find is in the hadith, the disputed oral traditions attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, very strong hadith saying you must not make images in general. The implication is of living being. It is said, otherwise you will be asked on the Day of Judgment to breathe life into these images and you will not be able to, and you will be punished severely if you are not able to. So the idea was you must not draw human faces or animals or birds or anything like that. Now, those hadiths were canonized later, a couple of centuries after the Prophet Muhammad himself, and in fact they are the main reason why groups like ISIS and the Taliban have gone around destroying ancient sites like Palmyra or the Bamiyan statues of the Buddhas in Afghanistan, whereas the rest of the Muslim world tends to be fairly relaxed about it. And again, this was the reason why the Taliban banned television in Afghanistan when they were ruling there. My own grandfather was a very strict Sunni theologian, and he banned photographs and television.
Radio okay, though?
Radio was fine. Radio
so
was
we're
absolutely
all right.
fine. And he used to listen to the news on the radio every morning. Now, the problem we have within Islam is that we have a puritanical fringe which is insistent on wiping out what they see as idolatry, even if ancient statues and idols are not being worshipped anymore. They haven't realized that such ancient sites are of immense historical and spiritual education. There's really no need to get so iconoclastic about it.
The extreme puritanical fringe Usama refers to are Muslims in the Wahhabi tradition. This highly orthodox form of Islam developed in the 18th century when the Ottoman Empire was decaying, and various reform movements arose to fill a vacuum of belief. What's interesting is that this moment has something in common with the Protestant Reformation in England in the 16th and 17th centuries. That period of state-sponsored assault on at first the evidence of devotion to spurious miracles, but which widened to an attack on all the images they equated with idolatry. Karen Armstrong is an historian of religion.
Just as Luther and Calvin wanted to go back to the early church and to the scriptures and discount all that medieval spirituality and law and just get back to basics, in the same way, Ibn Abd al-Wahhab, the 18th century reformer, wanted to get back to the 7th century pristine Islam at the time of the Prophet. He was particularly concerned by the various devotions that were going on around Sufi, the mystics of Islam, various holy men, holy Muslim, holy mystic men. Their tombs were revered in rather the same way as we have in the Christian West. And he found this very disturbing. Iconoclasm, in whatever form it takes, and it's cropped up periodically in history, is a concern about the diffusion of holiness, so that you must have no God but God. Similarly, in Judaism, you mustn't mention the name of God because holiness means concentration, and if it's all spread around, it gets cheapened. And so I think there was very much that feeling, especially in times of conflict, that we must focus on what is truly holy.
For one notorious iconoclast of the English Reformation, the focus on what is truly holy led to a personal mission to obliterate as much as he possibly could of the sacred art in the churches and colleges of East Anglia. William Dowsing, Basher Dowsing as he was known, was a Suffolk farmer and a Puritan. In 1643, during the Civil War, Dowsing and his demolition squad destroyed thousands of sculptures and carvings, paintings, screens, and stained glass windows. He was so proud of his godly work that he kept a detailed journal scrupulously recording the achievements of his gang of iconoclasts.
Idolaters! Where's the lamp? Hurry, in the name of God! Take the axe to it! Tear it down!
January 1643, at Clare, Suffolk. We broke down 1,000 pictures superstitious. I broke down 200. 3 of God the Father, and 3 of Christ and the Holy Lamb, and 3 of the Holy Ghost like a dove with wings. And the 12 apostles were carved in wood on the top of the roof, which we gave order to take down, and 20 cherubims to be taken down, and the sun and moon in the east window by the king's arms to be taken down.
For Puritans, this second wave of iconoclasm designed to secure the Reformation was part of a war to the end. These are people, after all, who believed that the world might well come to an end soon, and that they would have to account for their actions in stamping out evil in front of their maker. John Morrell is Professor of British and Irish History at Cambridge University.
In the 1640s, there was a deep belief that unless they got back to a true obedience to God and to the purity of his ordinances, there would be a new Babylon, and the new Babylon would be conquest by the Catholic superpowers. England would be once more enslaved by international Catholicism. 1 in 4 adult males bore arms. Probably about 1 in 10 died as a result of wounds or of the diseases that were borne by war. The economy was in ruins. The whole country is really descending into the terrible state that we see in some parts of the Middle East now. And it's that kind of world. And of course, what that breeds is extremism. I mean, we see it today, and it's exactly the same. That when the things you take for granted are being challenged and overthrown, then you think unthinkable thoughts. And you destroy the things that, previously bound you together with your neighbours.
One of the reasons we've not got so many good antiquities from the medieval period, say in the British Museum, is largely because they've all been destroyed in the radical Protestant destruction of images which belong to the old faith. There is an iconoclasm built into modernity in some ways, an unwillingness to tolerate what has been personally superseded, because in the pre-modern civilizations, continuity was vital. Civilization was often felt to be precarious, and it was felt to be more important to preserve what you'd achieved than to branch out and leave the past behind. It's only with the modern economy that you can look more to the future than to the past. And you're seeing it in IS in a distorted form, just as you saw it in early Protestantism, which is at the beginning of modernity, very early modernity.
But the image haters never in the end got in the way of the three great monotheisms. The dogma that Islam forbids images of the Prophet is belied by his appearance in many Muslim books, albeit with his face veiled or disguised by flame. And Islamic rule in the past has been characterized by a tolerance of the icons and religious rituals of others. How else could all the treasures of Egypt have survived? So, if there is nothing inherently iconoclastic in Islam, what motive can there be for the wielding of hammers, the driving of bulldozers? John Curtis.
I think part of the motivation is to wipe out memory. It's not just wiping out memory of previous religions, but also previous administrations and previous existences. The buildings and so on that survive in the region are memorials. Whether they're religious or whether they're secular in the first place, they are memorials of previous civilization, so that people don't think of themselves as the inheritors of a particular civilization or even a religion for that matter. But from now on, their total allegiance is going to be with the new state, with ISIS.
There certainly has been this tension since after the colonial period and the emergence of modern Muslim nation states, because the modern Muslim nation states like Egypt, Syria, Iraq and others needed, if you like, national symbols, so things like the national flag, the national anthem. But the ancient monuments are a much stronger symbol because, of course, they date back millennia. But again, from the early 20th century, you had a revival of Islamic fundamentalism in political terms, or what we call Islamism, which was partly a reaction to colonialism, which railed against this kind of thinking and said we have to be proud of our heritage as Muslims only. Pre-Islamic influences are jahiliyyah, they're un-Islamic. They're from the days of ignorance. And if you like, history starts at year zero when Islam starts for the Muslim fundamentalists.
And the caliphate ambition is an attempt to perpetuate that.
To recreate that, yes. But this kind of thinking explicitly says that we are only proud of our heritage as Muslims and Muslims alone. And any pre-Islamic heritage, whether it's ancient Egypt or the ancient sites in Iraq and Syria, Babylon and Nineveh, or in India and Pakistan, you have the ancient Sindhi civilizations, all have to be shut out of the modern Muslim psyche according to the fundamentalists. And what we've seen ISIS do in places like Palmyra and others is actually the logical extension of that kind of thinking. I mean, I've heard in Islamist and fundamentalist circles in Britain over the last 30 years, people expressing the ambition and hope to destroy the pyramids, for example, if there was a true Islamic revolution in Egypt. Because if your worldview is based only on Islamic history in a very narrow sense, a very superficial literalist reading of the Quran, then you don't really recognize the importance of the pre-Islamic symbols.
As ever, political and religious imperatives overlap in the fear the obliterators have that the supreme works of the past will lead people astray from blind, absolute obedience to the new rule. Neither beauty nor history have the least interest for them, because they live in and want to force others to inhabit a universe of timeless subjection. But there is a criminal dimension to this too.
It would be very surprising if there were not some people associated with ISIS who didn't see the chance to take advantage of this kind of destruction and to trade in antiquities. I'm sure that is happening. The looting of antiquities and the sale of antiquities has been endemic in the whole of the Middle East for many years. It started to gather pace, actually, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, when huge numbers of Afghan antiquities appeared on the Western market. And then there was a lot of looting during the first Gulf War in Iraq, and as we all know, in the second Gulf War as well. I myself actually was in Baghdad in 2003. I was the first Western archaeologist to go into the museum after it had been looted, and it was a horrendous sight. Every single room in the museum had been broken into, and 5 of the storerooms. And about, as far as we know, somewhere approaching 10,000 objects from the museum are still missing.
For the Islamic State, when they see a priceless antiquity, they don't see idolatry, they see dollar signs.
Matthew Bogdanos is a colonel in the United States Marine Corps, where his specialty is counter-terrorism. He's also an assistant district attorney for New York City, where one of his duties is to monitor antiquities trafficking. He was also there when the Baghdad Museum was looted, and he's followed the evolution of trafficking to the present day.
The Islamic State fell in on the already existing infrastructure that Al-Qaeda had formed. We have seen the Taliban use opium to support their activities in Afghanistan. We've seen blood diamonds being used in Sierra Leone. Well, Iraq and Syria do not have opium. They do not have diamonds. But what they have in, sadly, limited supply are antiquities, priceless relics to our shared cultural heritage. We should understand the consequences. There are currently approximately 4,500 archaeological sites that are in the Islamic State-controlled territory, whether it's Syria or Iraq. 4,500 sites. And each of those sites is being looted on an unprecedented scale. Sure, all of us see the YouTube videos posted by the Islamic State destroying the winged bulls of Nineveh and destroying other priceless statues in the museum at Mosul. And I am here to tell you that for every piece the Islamic State destroys on camera, hundreds of others line its coffers through the illegal trade that is buying the bullets and the bombs that are killing so many.
The trouble is that evidence of what's been looted, who smuggled it out through Lebanon or Turkey, and which collector might have bought stolen goods, is hard to find. A huge cache of 19 statues and reliefs, probably from southern Iraq and probably looted, was found in a shed in Shumen in eastern Bulgaria a few weeks ago. ISIS, which taxes every commercial activity in the areas it controls, also, apparently, issues permits for others to exploit archaeological sites. Robert Bewley.
What we don't know is exactly where all the looted material is. We've got ideas of where it comes out of the Middle East and where it might go to. The other thing we've heard is that if there's a trade in antiquities, there's then also a trade in fake antiquities. So there are people who are making fakes. So apparently the whole coin market is flooded with fakes. So then you've got to separate the fakes from the real ones. And it requires an awful lot of research to find out where they are. And it may be the case that actually a lot of them are being stored so they can sell them at some point in the future. Because to really make the money, they've got to have a good provenance. If they've got a document that they think is original, people will buy it.
But why should we care about these ancient artifacts when all about there are people dying, displaced, starving in the teeth of a complicated war, of which iconoclasm might just seem a small part?
Once you attack and destroy the cultural identity of a people, it is but a short step to destroy the people themselves. We should remember history. We should remember that the razing of old Warsaw predated predated the Holocaust. The looting and destruction of pagodas and mosques and churches by the Khmer Rouge predated the killing fields. Mullah Omar's destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan predated 9/11. My goodness, have we learned nothing from history?
Of course, these places are part of our shared human patrimony. All of humanity is poorer for their destruction. I think we grieve at not just the loss of beauty or history, sublime evidence of the achievement of previous civilizations, but for our own lost opportunities. Neither I nor my children nor my grandchildren will be able to see the wall reliefs in Nineveh or the winged bull of Nimrud. How poignant and innocent this BBC documentary about Palmyra, made in 1978, sounds to us now.
A ruined city in the desert. Here, you can imagine what Palmyra must have once looked like when this long, wide street was lined with shops and crowded with people. Ancient walls and temples, and so many columns that there might well seem to be at least 500,000 of them. Here, in the heart of the great colonnaded street, there were once statues, up there along those columns. And on this column, it says, "This is the statue of Septimia Zenobia, glorious and beautiful queen. It was put here by the senators and generals of this city in honor of their sovereign lady."
From a personal point of view, I'm particularly sorry about the destruction of the Assyrian palace at Nimrud, because I excavated at Nimrud in 1989. That was the last British excavation at the site. You could wander through the rooms. You go in through a gateway and then you probably see these winged bulls. And to visit the palace was a wonderful and evocative experience. It was actually the only place in the whole of the world where you could see an Assyrian palace.
I think that if people want to stop Islamic State destroying not just old buildings in Syria, but in Iraq, and now there's talk of them perhaps getting towards the Roman ruins in Libya, in Sabrata, and they are the most incredible, well-preserved Roman ruins. And so I think if people are worried about these really important pieces of history that IS wants to destroy, then what they need to do is work to destroy Islamic State.
But we'll wait a long time before we see UNESCO riding over the hills like cultural cavalry. And anyway, even before an intervention could be launched, the bulldozer boys would be congratulating themselves on having reduced further masterpieces to rubble and dust.